Bluegrass Jamalong is proud to be sponsored by Collins Guitars and Mandolins, each and every one built from the sound up in Austin, Texas. This episode is also brought to you by Peghead Nation, the home of roots music instruction. If you want to improve your playing, join me and thousands of other pickers getting better every day at pegheadnation.com. Hi, this is Matt and you're listening to Bluegrass Jamalong, the podcast for anyone and everyone who loves bluegrass. Hey everybody, welcome back to Bluegrass Jamalong. I have a slightly odd interview for you this week, and by odd I don't mean that it's a strange interview, I just mean that the subject matter is something maybe slightly unexpected. I'm interviewing a writer called Oliver Burkeman, who's written a book called 4,000 Weeks, and it's not about music, it's not about how to play music, it's not about being a musician, it's got nothing to do with music whatsoever. But I love it, and I feel like it's the kind of book that has wisdom in it that will really help some of you with some of the stuff that we all struggle with as musicians. And I say that because it helped me with some stuff I struggle with. I think sometimes with a busy life, it could be hard to fit in work and parenting and stuff and still find time for the things that you really kind of want to do for you as well. And this book really helped me with that, to the extent that I don't think this podcast would probably exist without it. I think I could have easily gone down the rabbit hole of trying to wait till I had the right tech or the right knowledge, or I understood more about bluegrass, or I kind of researched it, and I just got on with it in the end and started putting stuff out, and it was the absolute blessing that I did, and I think it's because of this book that I did that. And essentially it's a book about finding space in your life for things that are important and not waiting for the right moment, like I will do this when I've done all these other things, or when I retire, or when the kids are grown up, or like at some unspecified point in the future. If there's stuff that matters to you, start finding space in your life for it now. And I know that's tricky, and I know we all struggle with that kind of stuff, but there's a really interesting conversation with some kind of tips from Oliver on how to approach this, and I do think that you will enjoy this. I hope so. It's a bit of a random left field one, and I really think it will be an interesting conversation for all you musicians out there. I do hope so. Get in touch and let me know. But either way, I really enjoyed having this conversation. Oliver was a lovely bloke, fascinating, sort of humble, full of insight, and he was interested to have a conversation about this book in the context of something different. So it was a joy to do, and I hope you get something out of it. This is Oliver Burkeman. My guest on Bluegrass Jamalong this week is Oliver Burkeman, who's written a fantastic book called 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals, and it has nothing whatsoever to do with music. And I'm really, really interested by that, because I've read this book several times and found it extraordinarily useful. And it feels to me like there's so much stuff within its themes that could be useful in terms of framing some of the things musicians get stuck on. And we're about to find out if I'm right about that or not. Oliver, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much for inviting me. I'm looking forward to this. It's intriguing, yeah.
There's a very simple question on the back of the book that says, what if you stop trying to do everything? And I think what is fascinating about this book is it's called Time Management for Mortals, but it's not about time management at all. It's about stopping trying to manage time. And as a musician, and I'm going to just make a wild leap of faith here and presume that lots of people listening to this podcast are the same as me, and that we struggle with fitting things in, we struggle with kind of which things in life to commit to, finding times for the things that we're passionate about, and so many of the themes of the book touch on these things. And so I'd like to explore some. And what I think one of the most central concepts of the book that I found fascinating is the idea that we essentially are always looking to the future. I'll do this when this happens. I'll do this when I retire. I'll do this when I've done all my parenting, work, other things. And I think as musicians, it's very easy to be a musician who never finds the time to play music, because the dishwasher needs emptying, or the dog needs walking, or the children need something doing, or your boss has calls on your time. And after reading this book, I found like a huge weight lifted off my shoulders in terms of listing all the things that I should do and reframing them all as things I could do, and then working out which of those I actually wanted to do. And it seems like such a simple idea, and yet it's maybe one of the things we all struggle with most as human beings in all aspects of our life, not just, artistic endeavors, but just finding the time to do the things that matter.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I'd like to sort of start with what drew you to write this book, because I know you wrote a column about time management and productivity for a long time, and this feels like almost an antidote to that.
Yeah, I don't think that's a bad way to describe it. I sort of tend to think of it as, the column, which I did for many years, was partly about those subjects, partly about all sorts of other topics in the science of happiness and self-help culture and all the rest of it. And I sort of feel like the book came out of like where you get once you've been through that territory. One of the things that happens is you, as you sort of test out the 50th way of organizing your day and find that that's not the silver bullet either, you maybe get towards thinking that maybe there isn't a silver bullet. Maybe there's a sort of a kind of a second order change to go through, right? It's not just that you haven't found the one secret, but that there's something a bit strange about that, the psychology of that quest for one secret. So I do think it's kind of, it's written post my time as a fully paid up kind of productivity geek, as I describe it in the book. I'm still kind of a productivity geek in that sort of recovering fashion. I'm still totally going to download the app that somebody tells me has a completely revolutionary way of scheduling my day, just to sort of poke around and look at it. But I no longer, I've become sort of disillusioned in a positive sense, is how I think about it, right? I no longer think that's going to save me from the consequences of being a finite human with a limited amount of time in the day and a limited amount of time in my life. I just respond quickly to what you were saying about what you're sort of guessing is a common feeling among musicians. I think that I'm not super knowledgeable about the life of a professional or even sort of non-professional musician, but clearly it is one of those activities that, on the one hand, has a lot of power to feel deeply meaningful and enriching in the moment, right? So it's one of those things that even just speaking as a listener to music is something that can feel like a very, very meaningful way of spending your time in the moment. And at the same time, in our culture at this point in history, it's something that many people doing it are likely to be combining with other forms of income, not necessarily, but possibly. And so it there is that sort of sense that you've got to find time for it around the edges, maybe, even though on some level it feels like the center of a life. So I think it's not a surprise. I think it happens in other forms of artistic pursuit as well, that people feel these questions very, very intensely. If you just love hedge fund management and you are a hedge fund manager, it's kind of a bit simpler in a certain way, right? You get to spend all day making a living at the thing that completely excites you, and everything all matches up. But that's not always going to be the case for everything.
We'll be right back with you just after this. Collings Guitars has been a long-time supporter of the bluegrass community, from collaborating with artists to sponsoring festivals big and small, and now by sponsoring Bluegrass Jam Along. Handmade in Austin, Texas, every Collings guitar and mandolin that leaves the shop is built from the sound up, and the team loves seeing a Collings in the hands of players of all levels, from local musicians to world-renowned pickers. Visit collingsguitars.com for more. This episode is also brought to you by Peghead Nation, the home of roots music instruction. With 65 streaming video courses for guitar, mandolin, banjo, fiddle, dobro, bass and ukulele from some of the leading names in acoustic music, Peghead Nation has something for every picker. You'll learn the tunes and techniques you need to join in at jams and play the music you love, plus advanced techniques like improvisation, theory and ear training. Your first course is just $20 per month, and you can add more for $10 a month. Sign up for any course and get your first month free with the promo code JAMALONG, all one word. Join thousands of other players, including me, who are advancing on their instruments and having more fun playing the roots music they love at pegheadnation.com. No, and I think it's a funny one because in many ways the question we ask people most often when we meet them for the first time is, what do you do? Mm-hmm. And we're not saying, how do you occupy your time, your emotional kind of, how do you spend your emotional capital or whatever? We're saying, what do you do for money? Yeah. And we've sort of attached this thing to such a simple question. And I said, what do you do? Oh, I parent, I walk my dog, I play the guitar, I sit and look out the window and, but what I actually do is work in communications for a website. But that's not who I like. What we do and who we are very, and it's that, who we are is what we do. But there's one bit of it we've chosen to focus on. And I think it's to the detriment of all those glorious things we do just because we enjoy them and they make us feel good, like painting or running or writing a short story or playing some music or arranging some flowers or spending some time with a relative or looking out the window or,
Yeah. Yeah, no, completely. I think it's really interesting. It does, it's not only, obviously the way the criticism people usually have of that, of this prevalent outlook is that it puts sort of money ahead of other things. But in a way, it's not just that, right? It's also the idea of sort of putting instrumental activity. I'm going to be using this word instrumental probably multiple times in our conversation. It's got a sort of confusing double meaning in the context of speaking about music. But instrumentalizing activity, right? Things that we do in order to get to a different place. So you do work. You may love your work as well, right? It's not necessarily the case that you just do it for the money. Certainly not true of me, for example. But it does, by definition, take on this instrumental quality of like it's for something in the future. It's for getting to the end of a certain project. It's for making a living. It's for whatever it is. And obviously, a painter paints to get to the end of a painting, regardless of whether or not that's the center of their income. But there is also this quality of doing something for itself and being in the moment of doing it and finding it. And, I think at its best, that's what parenting can be like. And it's what artistic pursuits can be like, what it's what writing can be like. But it's constantly threatened, right? So parenting is constantly threatened by this idea of like, am I doing the right things for my child to be a successful future adult? And that's a really important thing to think about. But if it just becomes the only thing you're doing it for, that's a problem. And I'm really privileged to be able to mainly do the thing that I really like doing for work as the thing I make my living from. But even there, there's always this slight risk that it turns into something that I'm doing in order to have people receive it well, or in order for it to be commercially successful, that can actually take away from the sort of absorbing pleasure of doing it.
Yeah, and I think the start of my journey with getting my head around some of this was, like, I'd spent my teenage years playing music and my 20s playing music, and I was going to be in a band, I was going to be a musician. I knew this to be a fact, and yeah, I'm not. But that was the plan, and then I started writing fiction. It was like, well, I'm writing because I want to get published and have a book and all of that stuff. And in my 30s at some point, having played tennis for off and on bits and pieces for quite a bit, I joined a tennis club at the age of 30-something. And it became evidently clear to me the first day I did it that I wasn't doing this because at some point I thought I was going to win Wimbledon.
Right.
Like, it just wasn't on the cards. And the idea of doing something purely because I wanted to do it, and however good I get at that, it's not a bankable asset. I can't pass that skill on to my kids. Right. Like, there's nothing about that other than I want the challenge of enjoying running around a court and hopefully getting a bit better at tennis. And that was such a liberating thing. Yeah. Because there was no value in it other than the value of me enjoying doing it, really. And it can be fit and all of those things. But It was,
and you're speaking now about, as I write in the book, how I feel about music, right? I mean, it's about playing the piano. It's very likely that my level at playing piano is significantly below your level of tennis playing. But the point is, there's something very freeing about the fact that I just know I'm never going to earn a pound from that. It's really, it liberates you to focus on the pleasure of it. Yeah.
And so the question, I guess, is practically what steps people can take to reframe that, because there is this concept of pay yourself first, of do something and I find that if I get up in the morning before anybody else is up and I play my guitar for 20 minutes, then whatever else happens in the day, I've sort of banked that, and I've got 20 minutes of something, and whatever it is, whether it's that or something, but just having done a little bit of something for me first, I then spend the rest of the day a little bit less cross if I don't find time to do it, because I've already done it. And I was sort of wondering how, if it is as simple as that, or if there's, because people are busy in different ways. Some people have many kids, some people have 2 jobs, some people have aging parents to look after, some people have many more commitments than I do. And I don't want to sort of sit here and smugly say, well, of course you can find time to do this. But it's important, isn't it, to find even a tiny bit of time in the day that is your time.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think there's something universally true here, even while you make a good point about how different people's situations are. The universal truth is not that you can always get up half an hour earlier, because some people are already getting up 2 hours earlier to take care of other things and people. But there is this basic idea that if there are, just to sort of get completely abstract for a moment, and then I'll try to get concrete again, but if there are more genuinely valuable ways to spend your time in a day or in a lifetime than you'll ever have time for, then doing anything meaningful in life is by definition a question of neglecting a whole lot of others. And so really, I think that, I mean, I don't know how it works for you. Maybe you do just get up a bit earlier and there are no other claims on your time then. But a big part of how it works for a lot of people is you actually have to be tolerating a certain anxiety that comes from not getting straight onto your email or not attending to other things. So if I'm going to give the first sort of 2 or 3 hours of my main work day to the writing projects I'm working on, I have to be okay with the fact that there probably are people getting impatient with me because I haven't responded to an email or as you've experienced yourself, from emailing me, I mean, or, any number of other things that do call on my time. They're not irrelevant. They're not meaningless. It's just that something has got to be chosen over other things in that moment. And, we are all always making that choice to do something and to neglect other things. And if you want to have a meaningful life, then at some point you're going to have to choose to use some present moments to do things that are meaningful to you. Now, at the limit cases, there are people who cannot do anything but work their 3 jobs in order to avoid destitution or whatever it is, right? That's real. There are people like that. And in those cases, the calculation that they are implicitly or consciously making is, this is actually the most meaningful thing for me to do, even though it's not what I would optimally choose to be doing with my time. Actually supporting my family, keeping a roof over my head is the priority I've got to meet. But then everybody else, from that position up the scales of privilege, has at least some discretion over what they focus on. Maybe you'd get fired if you didn't reply to your boss's email for 48 hours, but you could get away with leaving it for 24, or maybe it's 12, whatever it is. There's that sort of wiggle room. And then you have to, if you use that wiggle room to race ahead and try to get on top of everything to clear the decks, then you'll just spend your whole life doing that, because they'll never be empty, because there'll always be more. And you do have to sort of establish that, I want to say establish a bridgehead, but I don't know if that's like a military metaphor I'm misusing. You have to just sort of place things that matter to you into your life and damn the consequences, in a sense, if you're going to get them done at all, because otherwise you're going to be constantly waiting for this hypothetical time later. And I do think, there's a dangerous ideology in self-help in general that says, like, you can choose anything. And if you want to walk away from the job you don't like and become a multimillionaire doing what you love tomorrow, just do it. I don't think that's true. But I do think that we have a general tendency to think that we have less choice than we do. So however much room for maneuver a person does have in their economic situation, in their family responsibilities, all the rest of it, they probably have a little bit more than they tend to assume.
And that's really interesting, is just that idea of you can walk away from your job and become a multimillionaire. It's like they're two different things. You can walk away from your job because there's something better for you to be doing.
Right.
And in time, perhaps you will become, and it's detaching I think for me, one of the biggest, and I'm going to talk about me here because I'm going to presume that other people have the same sort of struggles I do. And it's that thing of, rather than going, will I ever be this good at a thing, is just quietly understanding that if I do it a bit every day, of course I'm going to get better. And rather than try and get too caught up in this idea of where my limits are, like we get so caught up in the idea of where our limits are, we get nowhere near finding out. And if I can just choose a thing that is important to me and commit to it and do it more often than not in some form in my life on a regular basis, I'm going to get better at it.
Yeah.
And I've learned to dismantle this structure of reasons to beat myself up about various things. Like this idea that it's almost, rather than, I used to think of my life as being these huge chunks of rock that you've got to roll up a hill and then they roll back and you run. The goal is, once you've got the whole piece of rock to the top of the hill, you've somehow won.
Mm-hmm.
But of course you never do. And I've tried to kind of visualize it a bit more as just having this pile of little pebbles, and you try and take a few and put them on the good piles every day and try and not put them on the bad piles. And some will slip off and you'll forget and you'll put some on the wrong piles and somebody will nick your pebbles and all of that. But eventually you will end up with more pebbles in the right piles than you would have done by trying to put the whole rock in the pile in one go, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I've got a totally different thing about pebbles and rocks in my book, so my analogies are clashing, but I think yours makes perfect sense. And that sense of real, I never have really quite found the words for it, but when you're working incrementally in that way and developing the patience that is required and making that kind of progress, there's a real sense of kind of getting a purchase on life. That's the phrase that always comes to my mind. It's a kind of sort of agency or autonomy that you have in the world that comes from sort of, it's more valuable, I think, ultimately to us as humans, psychologically speaking, to have some real efficacy, to improve our skills, to make something, than it is to that matters more than the time scale on which it arrives. And there's just something so powerful about making things, about bringing things into reality, no matter how slowly. And it's reflected in this kind of, I always think in terms of writing. I mean, if you can consistently write 300 or 400 words most days, the output in terms of book length amounts of writing is as much as pretty much anybody who's ever published. That's 500 words a day would be it would be like one really quite long book or two short ones every year. Now I don't work in that incredibly consistent way because my writing is sort of months of research and another month of wandering around, smiting my forehead, trying to figure out what it's meant to be, and then writing huge amounts and writing less. So I'm quite irregular, but when I do get into those zones of 1,000 words each day, there's something really incredibly sort of empowering. I guess that's part of it. You're sort of taking responsibility for your life in a way that feels very good, even if it's a long game and it doesn't lead to any kind of overnight transformations.
And all the games, there are long games, really, I think. I love the phrase that the way you worded that was to write 500 words over most days. There's something I spotted in your newsletter recently with this idea of daily-ish.
Oh yeah.
And it's like this, we get so hung up on perfection of like, I'm going to have this habit of 100 days of yoga, or like, and you don't do 100 days of yoga, you've got to go back to the beginning and start again. But if you do 98 out of 100, you've done 98 more days yoga than you were probably going to do. That feels like a win to me. And yet somehow we managed to frame it as a failure. So if I say I'm going to play my guitar for half an hour every day, and I play it for 25 minutes 4 times over the course of the week, that's still more than if I hadn't done anything. Absolutely. And it's just like, so much of this is about reframing it's not about really changing stuff. It's just about reframing your attitude to things. There's something you mentioned in the book about, I think you sort of talk about it being a Zen Buddhist idea that essentially emotional pain comes from nothing other than wishing things were different than they are.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's, I think there is a sort of, at least hypothetical truth that arises from Buddhist psychology. I don't know that I know anyone who's taken it to the perfect final place, but that if you could give 100% of your attention to what was happening to you in the moment, sometimes that would be physically painful, but it would never be, you would have no attentional bandwidth left to suffer and object and feel miserable and wish things were different. So that, the sort of hypothetical, perfectly focused person would always be sort of deeply absorbed in life, because feeling dissatisfied with what we're doing is kind of a function of not quite being fully absorbed in it. And it's interesting to me to consider that might be true even of kind of intense physical pain or something. I mean, I think this is the sort of, we're in the kind of heart of this idea that what matters is like doing the thing, that taking the action that belongs to the project that you love and that expresses your love for the project, not, building a habit to do something or becoming the kind of person who always does it. Those things can help, and maybe certain kinds of plan to do something every day for 30 days or something can be really helpful for people, but it's very easy to get sidetracked into the idea that it's about changing the kind of person that you are. And I think that ultimately, in some sense, what makes music or writing or really anything, conversation, being in nature, absorbing, to put it in a really Buddhist way, is that you are somehow absent at the center of it, right? It's like it's a giving of your attention in more and more completely to the act of doing and the reality as a whole. So all these kinds of things about building better habits, though they have their uses, can sort of risk putting you back into that, like, am I doing enough? Should I do this many? Have I failed? Am I a bad person because I only did it for 3 days this week instead of 7? Which all sort of take you away from the thing which people, and I'm sure working musicians as much, if not more than anybody, know, which is sort of absolutely being in it completely sometimes.
Yeah, and we all experience that. And as the vast majority of people who listen to this podcast will be amateur musicians who are trying to improve and trying to get better and coming up against so many kind of perceived barriers to that. And I'm one of these people. I have this picture in my head of all the, I've interviewed some truly extraordinary musicians on this podcast, and in my head, they're all, they've reached the destination and they're all swanning around with a martini, congratulating each other and saying, "Isn't the view beautiful from the destination we've arrived at?" and they're not. They're just going, "Here I am. What's next?" They're all dissatisfied with how they're doing, and they're all looking for improvements and gradually putting some more pebbles in the right piles on a daily basis.
Yeah,
and it's extraordinarily freeing to understand that so many of the things that I feel slow me down as a musician are just basically me. Worrying about how good somebody else is, I can't control that. Worrying about like if I had a better guitar, I'd be a better musician. I might have a nicer guitar, but it wouldn't make me any better at playing it. I have a nice enough guitar, and I still find time to look at new guitars because I enjoy it. But if I spent that time playing, and so there's so many beautiful ideas in the book about just how to kind of just it's not about reaching a destination. It's just about taking another step down the road in the right direction. And there's a metaphor in there called staying on the bus that I'd love to talk about briefly.
Yeah, I'll tell that story if you'd like. I just want to say, I think what you're saying here is completely right. And I think just to bring it out one step further, there is something about like there's some sense in which you wouldn't want to get to the destination, right? And I think occasionally you do see people in certain forms of celebrity lifestyle who maybe have got to the destination and then just have to start, developing severe substance abuse issues to try to keep things interesting or something. That's probably a very unfair way of characterizing it. But, the fact that you are not at the end of a process of learning an area, learning an instrument, or figuring out how to write books or whatever it is, like that's what keeps it alive. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. So yeah, just very quickly, staying on the bus. This comes from a Finnish American photographer and teacher of photography called Arno Minkinen, who somewhat famously tells this story to his students. It's about the need in creative pursuits to be willing to keep going through a phase of practice that feels like you're not doing anything original. It feels like you're just copying other people and feels like you're just learning how to replicate things that other people have done. It can't be told that quickly because I need to just sort of set up the idea, which is that the way he tells it, the bus system in Helsinki is laid out such that at the city centre, lots of the bus routes all follow the same route, stopping at all the same stops for the duration of the time that they're right in the centre of the city. And he says, imagine that one stop, that the distance between two stops on a bus route is a year in your career as a photographer, right? So you get on a bus and you start working and you collect a portfolio of photographs, and then you take them to a gallery, and the person at the gallery says, well, I'm not interested in these. They're exactly the same as somebody else's. So you go back to the bus station, you're on a different bus, and that goes, you spend a year getting to another place, you've got a whole new portfolio of things, but you take them to the gallery and they're condemned for being derivative too. Because in those early stages of a journey, just to sort of drive this analogy, right? All the buses are following the same route, and people you can use up a whole career this way, constantly going back to the beginning and finding that every time you set off on a new bus journey, it's actually following the same route as everybody else. And so the question is, like he says, like, how do you? What's the answer? How do you reach originality and make it through being derivative? And the answer is, as he puts it, stay on the fucking bus. If you stick on a single journey, eventually what happens, again, in the Helsinki bus system, is that all these bus routes, once they reach the city limit, start spreading out to new, different destinations, right? So if you're willing to go through those early stops of being like other people, that's when you get to the original place. So maybe there's a little bit too much about Finnish public transport in that analogy, but you get the basic idea. There's a famous line from Ira Glass, the American radio producer, saying something a bit similar, which is that there's a sense in which when you're early in the process of learning something, your taste is sort of more refined than your abilities. So you find what you're doing to be no good because you are actually someone who is really, I mean, firstly, you only came into this field of endeavor because you had a well-developed taste in it. Secondly, you're sort of constantly looking at other people and seeing what they're doing. So you're always feeling like, well, I'm just copying them, or I'm just I'm just not as good as them. It's a slightly different point, but it's related. And the only answer both these people say, and I think it's probably true, is that you just have to sort of learn to tolerate being in that place, because it's hanging out in that place for a while and keeping going that will allow you to break through to the other side of it. And, I made the point in the book that you could apply this to things like relationships, right? If you're sort of always looking for completely original excitement, and never willing to go through the sort of parts of a long-term relationship that do involve things that look a bit conventional, settling down, buying a house, getting, then you're pretty much destined never to get through to the place where you're with a sort of long-term life partner for decades, which might be fine. Maybe that's not for you, but the original stuff, the unique stuff, the special stuff often comes on the other side of a period of something that doesn't feel like you're necessarily on the right path.
I think that's it. I find that really interesting.
Not a short answer. Sorry.
No. But I think it's an important point because for so many people, I essentially mean me when I say so many people, but I know there will be other people like me, and I've met several of them. It's that idea of you spend a year or two learning an instrument and you get reasonably good because the progress early on can often be reasonably speedy. And then you get to a point where it gets a bit harder and a bit harder. And then people will, maybe I'm playing the wrong instrument. Maybe instead of guitar, I should play the banjo. And then you spend a year or two getting to, stop 2 on the banjo route, which is a similar distance out of town to stop 2 on the guitar route, funnily enough. And then you go, well, this is really tricky now. Maybe I should be playing the mandolin. Or maybe I should go back to the guitar. And then you get to stop 3 on the guitar and you go, this is really hard now. But it's that idea of picking the thing that actually speaks to you and just every day, as much as you can, or every week, or however often, you're just constantly trying to get to the next stop. What's the next thing? What's the next thing? And it can be so hard to do because you can look across at the other bus and go, they look like having more fun on that bus, or it's exactly the same as in a big queues at supermarkets. The other queue is always moving faster than your queue until you join it.
Yeah.
And then your queue is somehow moving faster than the one you were in.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting, and not to turn this into a parenting discussion. We certainly don't have to, but it's putting me in mind of the interesting challenges of sort of thinking about just in the context of music. And my son, who has piano lessons but isn't particularly interested in doing any practice between them, and I'm certainly determined not to become one of these crazy parents who's trying to live out their unfulfilled dreams by being a sort of brutal disciplinarian on his children's music or anything like, or any other thing. But on the other hand, it feels that it's probably wrong to just completely capitulate at the first objection, because that's not what being a helpful parent is. And so there's something very related here in terms of the stance that I hope I'm endeavoring to take towards a 7-year-old, in terms of the stance we take towards ourselves, right? Because there's it's not a question of remaining on the bus when it's very, very clear that you hate this bus and everyone on it is a totally different kind of person than you. And, let's stop this metaphor here, but you know what I mean? You can be on the wrong bus. And yet, on the other hand, a certain kind of firmness with yourself that sort of doesn't take your immediate emotional reactions to things as the be all and end all is really important. And I think some people are prone to sort of massively overindulging themselves, but some people are prone to beating themselves up, and that's probably the end of the spectrum that I'm on. So you do need to sort of navigate that quite carefully and intuitively to make sure that you sort of push yourself to stick with things without turning it into some sort of servitude that you've got to do in order to prove something about yourself.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the most powerful things for me was just reframing things I should do into things I could do, and then choosing which of them I wanted to or needed to for whatever reason, And it becomes slightly easier to let go of things if they're just things you could do rather than things you should do.
Right.
Because so many of the shoulds in our lives are not based on our value judgments. They're based on other people's and what we think they're going to think of us if we do or don't do those things, when actually they're not paying any attention to us in the first place anyway. And but you go down this rabbit hole of it. And there's something in that about, and I'm going to extend the metaphor because I love extending metaphors. It's my favorite thing to do. Is for some musicians, it's the idea of getting on the bus in the first place. And there's so many, because the way this podcast started was during lockdown. I was playing guitar at home for people to play along with because they couldn't go to a jam session or whatever. But I realised that a lot of people were using it to get the confidence to go to a jam session.
Right.
And this idea of, well, when I get good enough, I'll go and play music with other people.
Yeah.
And this is one of the areas in the book, actually, where you do touch on music and this idea of playing music with other people and the friction of having to do that. Like, you will get better at playing music if you do it with other people, but also the benefit of doing anything with other people is sort of slightly detached from whatever the thing is anyway. Just doing things collectively and being in a period of time collectively with other people is an extraordinary, powerful thing, isn't it?
Yeah, no, totally. And there's a whole section in the book about sort of time as a shared good, basically, and how we tend to think in our society in a sort of misleading way. I think that getting more and more and more solo control over our time is the goal. And actually, there's all sorts of reason to believe that, well, I mean, just in a very obvious sense, like almost anything that is worth doing requires some kind of synchronization with other people's time. And this sort of happens on all sorts of different levels, right? You can't have a social life if you can't synchronize your schedules with some people you'd like to meet up with. I think it's a really telling, famous phenomenon of modern life, right? Which is like, I don't feel like I've got a particularly crammed schedule, social schedule. And I don't think my friend Chris has a really crammed social schedule, but we've been literally spending the last 4 months trying to come up with one day that is synchronized in our lives, because a long time ago, in a more traditional time, which would have had all sorts of downsides for many kinds of people, but when everybody stopped working on Sundays and visited each other, right, it was all lined up. It was all when we all worked for, lots of people anyway, worked for kind of large benevolent companies that everyone left at 5 p.m. to go home. It would have all been much more easy to do these things. We've actually become, partly through additional freedom, there are other factors as well, more and more out of sync with each other. And then, and the specifically musical side of this that I write about is my experiences, which I think are extremely common, of singing in an amateur choir. Especially in the last sort of decade, with a huge resurgence of that, I think, in the UK anyway. Mm-hmm. And the phenomenon there, you'll have to tell me, I suspect that this doesn't work in sort of small musical ensembles of, a few guitars and drums and a vocalist or something, but it's certainly in large choirs, this just absolutely amazing phenomenon where, just as I understand it, just because of the averaging out of sharp voices and flat voices, the sum of the parts is so much weight. It's much greater than the sum of its parts. You feel like you belong to and are singing as part of a group, only a tiny number of whom have the talent to sound that good in a solo situation. And that is both just wonderfully great to just in terms of sort of endorphins or whatever. But I think there's something quite deep there about collaboration and synchronization and working together. And it's not an illusion, right? I mean, the audience experiences the choir as significantly better than if it was just, slightly flat tenors like me multiplied enough times. but without that effect happening. So it's kind of really fascinating.
And I think, like musically, it probably is different in a smaller group, but there's something like if you sit and play music on your own at home, and particularly with bluegrass music, it can often appear to be flashy and fast and intricate, but actually you can sit and strum 3 chords behind something else. You can play very little, and it feels like a connection and a collaboration and a thing. You don't need to be able to play very much to go and enjoy a bluegrass session if you're just playing chords behind. And the joy of bluegrass is that wherever you go in the world, you've got a shared repertoire of stuff you can sit down and immediately start having a conversation with people, like rather than sort of, 3 rock guitarists from slightly different genres get together. They might struggle to find a thing to play, but if you turn up with a bunch of bluegrass musicians, not only can you start having a conversation with them pretty quickly, there's also something about those kinds of jam sessions that they're intergenerational, and they generally cross political and socio-economic lines to some extent. And like often you won't know the politics of people you play with. I've been playing the same jam session for years, and like I've known these people for a long time. And we talk about music and we talk about what's going on in our lives between songs and stuff. But like there's so much stuff that doesn't matter how they feel about other things that I might totally dismiss them for in another context.
I think this is so interesting because it, in some ways it might be a kind of, you might sort of see it as a kind of a preserved fossil of something that maybe was a lot more widespread in other corners of the culture until fairly recently. And it's reminding me of work from a political scientist I know a bit called Robert Talisse, who is based in Nashville. So got some strong musical interests as well. And he sort of makes this point that something that we're very, very keen to believe about how to solve polarization in politics these days is that we've got to bring people together from different sides and sort of talk this stuff out and have difficult conversations. And you've got to get like the Brexit supporter and the Remainer to sort of talk about that stuff. And actually, The Guardian has a little feature where they have people have dinner and talk about politics in exactly this way. But there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that when you put people in a room from different sides of something and have them talk about politics, they just end up more entrenched in the viewpoint that they went into. And Talisse makes this argument that actually, he wrote a book called Overdoing Democracy, where he makes this argument that actually what we really need to be doing is exactly what you say, right? Hanging out with people who may well be on the other side of us on these big issues in contexts where we have no idea that is their opinion on that, in contexts where we're not relating to each other as sort of avatars for our political positions, and just sort of weaving the social fabric from which, if that is stronger, then society can much more easily tolerate people with radically different political views, and they don't sort of start pulling the seams of it all apart when they get to a certain level of polarization. So I think that idea of like, I'm sort of envious of how you describe the jam sessions, but also when I've occasionally been in that kind of situation myself, as one is sometimes out here in the countryside in North Yorkshire, old people, young people, if you got them into certain discussions about certain topics, I might not always agree with them on things, but it's like, it's the fact that we're doing stuff and not having that conversation that makes it so human and important.
Well, I think what it gives you is like a connection with somebody else as a human being who is a bit like you before you start looking for the ways they're not like you. Right. So you can meet 15 people and sit and have a chat and get on very well, and they're all wearing a black T-shirt. If the same 15 people walked into the room all wearing different football T-shirts, for example, certain people immediately take against certain other people because of the team they support, regardless of the much more deeply lying stuff and the fact that most of us are similar in most ways anyway, and we have far more in common than we don't. And I think music's a wonderful thing for that, and I think that's one of the joys of, and for me, one of the joys of doing the podcast is getting to somehow participate in this global community of musicians and feel like I belong to it in some ways. And it's, I think belonging is such a important thing. I think we've gone through decades of, it's sort of like you were saying about individual autonomy over time. just this idea that we're individuals and not a society. It's pretty damaging. I think we are a society made up of individuals, but we can get to, and I'm maybe getting off topic here, but I think it's related to music, in that it's just this idea that it's generally, there's one other thing that's great about, folk music, bluegrass music, so much kind of non-pop music. It's less about the status of the individual than about the collective thing. And there's something really powerful about that.
I'm interested in how you see it working in your life, that you're a British person immersed in a primarily originally American musical tradition, because I wonder if, I don't know enough about this, but I wonder if in fact the sort of English folk music milieu is just pretty straightforwardly properly left-wing, and the politics of every single person in that context, and whether there's something useful about the fact that you're sort of at a slight angle to it, speaking as someone who's spent a large chunk of my adult life living in America.
I think there's definitely some of that, but I also think that English folk music is a funny beast, because the Irish have a pretty strong connection to their folk music. I think the Scots do. I think the Welsh probably do. I think your average English person might not know a folk song from England if it bit them on the bum, because we've largely not been in a position where people have tried to we've not needed our culture as a weapon or a shield or a sustenance in the way that a lot of other people around the world have. And so perhaps you have a slightly different relationship with it. And I don't know if that's true. And bluegrass is a very young music, really. It's only been around since the 40s. It's not really it's based on much older forms of music, and so it's really interesting, like how people come together over this stuff, because people can come together over folk music for very different reasons. Some to actively play it in an ongoing living tradition, and some to sort of pin it on a board like a butterfly and study it.
Right.
And they're very different approaches to the same thing, and they're valid things to do. But it's fascinating. There's a whole, that's a whole other bus we could get on and stay on for many, many, many stops.
Yeah.
And I think sort of as we sort of approach the end of this conversation, I'm really keen. The reason I wanted to have this in the first place is because I found it, so many of the things in the book were so helpful to me in terms of framing how to spend not my time. This is the interesting thing. It's not about your time, really. It's about your attention. And attention is a nice way, the way you spend your attention, the things you attend to, the things you put your attention on are essentially what your life is. But somehow attention is a less measurable thing than time. And I think that can be helpful. But what I really want is for people to hopefully take some of this and be able to find ways of making more music, if that's the way they want, and have permission to do it without it being about it has to make money or it has to lead to this or they have to get to this place to be able to do it. That it's just a valuable thing to do in and of itself, if that's the thing that makes you happy. And one of the strongest things that came out of the book for me was this idea that actually, whether you are any good at being in the moment or not, that's all you can do.
Right.
Every moment arrives, you are in it.
Yeah.
The next one arrives, you are in it.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you are desperately trying to look at other moments to avoid being in that moment, you are still in that moment.
Right.
And so find some moments in the day to spend on the things you love, I guess.
Yeah, and don't even turn that into a project of I've got to figure out how to find some moments, right? Spend a moment. Choose something that you've been meaning to spend your time on and you haven't, and do it for 20 minutes today, or if you're listening to this late at night, then okay, tomorrow, but soon. Maybe every day for the rest of your life, but maybe not. Like maybe once. Maybe you never get back to it again. But you can only manifest any of this by doing something rather than making plans for how you're going to become the kind of person who's going to do it. And it's a lot easier, right? I mean, the demand is just turn your attention to that for a little bit and take it from there. There's a lovely quote from Jung, which I mention in the book, about how somebody's asked him like how to have a meaningful life, and he makes some slightly sarcastic comments about how you can join a big religious institution if you want to be told how to live. But really all you need to do is just do the next most necessary thing, and then the next, and then the next, not worrying too much about how to calculate most necessary, but just sort of following your intuition and sort of taking full responsibility for the next moment, but not beating yourself up and trying to take responsibility for any other moments, you know?
Yeah, and you were just saying now about living in the countryside in North Yorkshire. It really put me strongly in mind of this sort of old British, I don't even know if it's a joke, but the idea that some guy from the city is driving around in the middle of the countryside totally lost. He's trying to, where his sat-nav's gone and he's got no signal. He's trying to work out where to get to. And there's old guy leaning on a gate. And so he pulls over and goes, "Can you tell me how to get to the city from here?" And the guy sort of looks up one way up the lane, scratches his head, looks the other way up the lane, scratches his head, and goes, "You know what? I wouldn't start from here."
Yeah.
And
just ring a bell.
We can only start from here.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things the book helped me to do with the podcast was start from here. Mm-hmm. And not list all the reasons that I wasn't a good enough guitarist or I didn't know enough. Or It helped me accept that part of doing the podcast is just that I want to do it and I want to have these conversations and I'm curious about these things. And if I just lean into that, hopefully other people will be curious about the same things I am and something interesting will come out of it that is good for all of us. And largely that's been true. And I get totally distracted by thinking about, can I make a living out of this? And will it do this? And will it do it? But this podcast is absolutely at its best, where it just go, what next? Who shall I talk to next? Right.
And that actually is the best way to maximize the chances of doing things like making a living out of it or greatly increasing its listenership or any other goal that you might have, is to just step into the next moment. Not that can't occasionally involve some future planning and some, judicious strategizing. That has a role too. That's one way to use a present moment. But above all, it's just doing the thing. Yeah.
And I think that's a beautiful place to end. Thanks so much, both for a book that I don't know that it changed my life so much as just allowed me to see what it was and walk into it a bit more fully. But also for a lovely conversation. And I hope there's some nuggets in here, that some threads people will pick up and pull on and just feel a bit better about being able to do the things they want to do and enjoy them.
I hope so. That would be wonderful. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's been a great conversation.
Bluegrass Jamalong is proud to be sponsored by Collings Guitars and Mandolins, making some of the finest guitars and mandolins in the world since the 1970s. Visit collingsguitars.com and find out why.